Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Evidence, and in today's video we are going to be talking about SQL LEAD window functions. So I've written a blog post about this and I'm just going to use it as a point of reference as we go through this tutorial. And over here on the right side I have SQLite open, and I have the employees database open. And at the end of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get access to this employee database. Actually, I think maybe I'll show you right now so that you will follow along. You can follow along if you want. So if you go to this blog post here that I wrote, it will tell you how to install SQLite on your Windows or Mac computer. If you don't have that already, you can install it right there. And I have another blog post that also talks about how to use SQLite. I'm going to link to both of those videos if you need to have SQLite set up. And also here, if you join my free technical resources, you get access to this database and many other databases that I have. That's employees database right there. So with that being said, let's go ahead and begin. For this tutorial, I'm going to show you the syntax, and then I'll explain what the syntax means, the syntax for SQL LEAD Window Function, and then I'll show you multiple examples, and I'll show you a use case for SQL LEAD Window Functions, right? Because sometimes it's easy to learn a new skill, but actually knowing when to use that skill and what purpose that skill is for is also very important. So at the end of this video, towards the end, I'll show you SQL LEAD Window Function practical use case. Let's begin with the syntax. So this right here is the syntax for SQL LEAD Window Function. I'm just gonna paste it here so it's easier to see because SQLite has syntax highlighting. And just looking at this syntax might be a little intimidating. So I'm just going to explain it very quickly. Let's start with lead. Lead right here is just the SQL keyword clause to identify this function. And then next we have return value. Return value is like the column of SQL query that you want to be used as the basis for the lead window function, right? That's what you want to return. And then offset is like how many rows from the current row should be returned. So the default value for offset in SQL is 1. And offset is basically means like from what row you should start returning the data. Normally, SQL starts returning the data from the first row, but you can choose to start returning data from the second row or third row. That's what offset means. And I'll show examples of using offset in this video. And then the next thing is default. So with lead window function, right? Lead window function gives you the next row from the current row. That's what it does. But what if there is no next row? Like what do you do, right? So normally SQL will just return null when there is no next row, but you can specify a value. Instead of returning null, you can return something like not applicable or missing year or missing data or whatever. So when there's no next row to return, you can specify a value, and that's what default is. And I'm going to show an example of using default as well. And so that's kind of explains this part. Now let's move on to this part of the syntax. This is over and then partition by. So partition basically breaks your data into windows. right, into certain groups. And partition is just a way to group your related data together by a column. And you can use more than one column for your partition, but this is not the same thing as group by. And when you do not specify a partition, then the entire data set is used as a single partition. And once again, below I have example of partition, and that will make it easier to kind of understand how the partition works. And order by right here is how you should order the data. And you can use more than one column for your order by. And also, lead window function is not order dependent. There are some window functions that are order dependent, which means the order by clause is required, but lead window function is not order dependent, so order by clause is not required. With that being said, that is basically the explanation for the syntax. Let's go ahead and look at some practical examples. So like I said earlier, I am using the employees database. And I showed you how to get access to this database. And I also put instructions of how to get this database in the comment section, in the description for this video. Let's move on to some practical examples. So this first example is basically using default for everything, right? So let me go ahead and copy this so it makes it easier for you to keep track of where we are, of what we are doing. For this right here, for this first example, this is just using the default. So I'm not specifying a special value for offset or default or partition, right? I'm just using the default values. I'm selecting some column names, and then I'm doing lead, a higher date for my return value. The default offset is 1. I don't even need to specify it right here if I do not want to. And then I'm just using the default right here. And partition, I'm not doing any partition, so the entire data set is being treated as a single partition. And then I'm doing order by higher date. And this lead window function right here, I am saving it as, I am aliasing it as hired next. So it's going to show up as this hired next column. Let's go ahead and run this. And here is our results, right? It's the same thing I have here in this picture. And with lead window function, basically it gives you the next row from your current row. That's how it works. So this right here is the original row, hired date, and hired next, like I identified here, is the lead window function. And if you look close, you can see like the value here in row number 1 is the same value as this, right? It's giving you the value in the next row. The value here on row number 3 is the same thing as this. It's giving you the next value. The value here on row number 5 is the same as what's on number 6. It's giving you the next value. So that's what lead window function does. Now let's look at some examples that are a little bit more involved. The second example here is offset. So originally the offset here is 1 because that's the default value, right? And now we are going to do an offset of 2. And I'm just going to use the exact same example that I have here in this blog. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it right here. And as you can see, it's the exact same code as this one right here, but this time I specified 2 as the offset. And you're going to see how it differs. Let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see right here, if you look, it's probably easier to see with this example, like the value here in row number 1 is the same as what's in row number 3. The value in row number 5 is same thing as what's on row number 7. So that's what it means by offset, right? So instead of the lead window function starting from the first row, which is this first row relative to the current row of interest. It is starting from the second row, right? Because the offset is set as 2. So this value here matches with this value. And if we go to row number 2, right here, for example, the next row will typically be this. But because we specified 2 as the offset, the value that is here on row number 2 for this lead window function is actually 2 rows below, as opposed to 1 row below. So that's what offset does. And let's look at the same thing, but with like an offset of 5. So this is the exact same thing as the code above, but this time we are setting the offset as 5. And we'll go ahead and run this. And as you can see, what's here on row number 1 for hired nest is the same thing as what's on row number 6, right? So instead of going to the next row, it went 5 rows down from the current row of interest. Same applies here on row number 2. Instead of starting here, it goes 5 rows down for the row of interest. So whatever you specify here on the offset determines what row the query will start returning from. I hope these 3 examples really get the point of offset home. Let's move on to another example, partitioning. So if we go back to the syntax real quick, as you can see here, we have return value, we have offset, we have default. We're gonna get back to default, an example of default in a minute. But first, let's do partition. So here it says partition by, and then it has expression 1 and expression 2. Let's go ahead and look at an example of partition. And let's look at this code real quick. So this is the same thing as before, but this time we are doing partition, and we are doing partition by department name. So we are using department name to group them together. And we are saving this partition as, we are saving this lead window function as hired next date. And since the department is from a different table, we are doing an inner join to bring it in. Let's go ahead and run this and see the results. And right here, so if you look closely, we have a new column called department name. And as you can see, everything here is organized by department. We have accounting, then we have administration, we have executive, we have finance. So all the data is grouped together by the department because we specify department name as the partition window. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but up here when we did not specify partition, the entire data set is treated as a single partition. So now that we have this partition, let's go through it. So this is the first one, and as you can see, right, so this we have 1 as the offset because that's the default. This right here, the value for the hired nest for the lead window function is the next one because it is in the same department. But then when you get to this right here is null because this is the end of this particular window. This is the end of this department. There's no more value for the accounting department. That's why this is null. So at the end of a window, the lead window function restarts, right? So this window, this accounting department is one window, right? The executive is one window, the administration is one window, the executive is one window, and at the end of each window, basically the function starts over. That's how partitions work. So at the end of the finance window, the partition starts over and the function that is applied to that partition starts over. So it's basically partition is a way to apply a function or apply a query to a small window, like small subset of the data as opposed to the entire data, right? So this lead window function is being applied to just this subset of data, and then it starts over and is applied to this subset of data, and then it starts over, then it's applied to this subset of data. That's partitions. So let me bring this down a little bit more. And as you can see right here, this is null, and this is null because, like I mentioned earlier, default right here, when nothing is defined, when there is no value in the next window, then null is what is returned, and null is the default value. So in the next example, I'm going to show you how to specify a value for default. And as you can see right here, in administration, there's no more value in the administration department, so null is returned, and null is the default. If we look at the executive department here, a value is returned here because there's a value is returned here because there's a value, but there's no value returned here because there's nothing more in the executive department. And same thing applies to finance. That's how partitions work, and I hope that makes sense to you. And of course, you can customize this by putting in an offset value right here if you wanted to. That's partitioning for you. Let's go ahead and look at default. Like I mentioned earlier, we have null right here for the default, but we can choose a different value for the default. And let's scroll down, and let's go ahead and copy this. This is the next example. Let's go ahead and copy the code here. This is the exact same code as the one we just looked at. The only difference is that I specified a value for not applicable. So if you notice here, I specified a value for default. If we go back to the syntax real quick, the syntax order does matter, right? First, we have return value, then we have offset, then we have default. If you're going to define a default value, you need to also specify offset, because SQL expects return value first, then offset second, then default. If you do not specify offset and then you just specify default, it's going to think what you specified for default is actually offset. So the order does matter. I just wanted to point that out. But here, return value default, return value offset using the default offset of 1. And then we have not applicable. So I replace null. I'm going to replace all the nulls right here with not applicable, and everything else stays the same. Let's go ahead and run this. And just like that, everything that was null is replaced with not applicable. Right, so this is one way to replace the default value, and you can put anything you want here. You can even put a number if you want to. So here I'm using string, but I could put, let's say, the number 10. And then wherever there's supposed to be a null, there's going to be the number 10. There we go. We got 10, 10, 10, 10. So that's default. And now I believe the last example I have here is a use case. And like I said earlier, learning something new is nice. But actually knowing how to use it, or knowing when to use it, like, is very, very important. Whenever I learn something new, I don't just take it at face value. I try to find out, when do I use it? Like, when is this important? Like, what is the actual use case? What problems will warrant me to actually use this thing that I just learned? That's why I try to include use cases in my tutorials. So let's go ahead and copy this. And this is the code that I have for the use case. And basically, what this code is doing, it is getting the difference between when one employee was hired and when the next employee was hired. So with this, I'm using a CTE. CTE means Common Table Expression. And this is the CTE right here. And it's basically something you've seen before. I'm just selecting some columns. I'm using all the default values. I'm using 1 as the offset and default as the default. I'm not specifying any partition. And this is basically the query. And we can run this query by on its own to kind of see what it looks like. Let's go ahead and run that. And this is the query. So basically, instead of doing a sub query, I'm doing a common table expression using this width right here. And I am selecting everything from this width. And basically, I am calculating the difference between when this employee was hired date, and when the next employee was hired. So Julian day is how you calculate the difference between two dates using SQLite. How you calculate the date difference between two columns varies slightly depending on the database management system you're using. But that's enough explanation. Let me go ahead and run this. And right here we have higher difference. So basically I'm saving this date difference as higher diff. And as you can see right here, this is the difference between when Jennifer was hired. 92 days is the difference between when Jennifer was hired and when Stephen was hired, right? Because with this code, I am doing hired next, which is the lead function right here, minus the original date. And we have 92. And if we move on to the next one, we have the difference between when Nina was hired and when Jennifer was hired. And that's 735 days. So I'm doing hired next, which is this value. And this value matches with when Nina was hired, right? Minus when Jennifer was hired. And then we have this one at 104 days. So this value right here is when Alexander was hired, right? And this 104 days is the difference between when Alexander was hired and when Nina was hired. And I think you kind of get it. So that's one use case for SQL LEAD Window Function. I'm sure there are other use cases. If there are other use cases that you've used in the past or you can think of for SQL LEAD Window Function, let me know in the comment section. But this is one use case and it's really nice and it's helpful. Anyway, that's it for this video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you know somebody who this video is going to be helpful to, please feel free to share this video to them. And you can follow me on LinkedIn, GitHub, or Twitter, and I will have the link to my social media in the comment section. And you can join my free technical resources, and you can get access to this particular database, employees database, and any other database that I have available. And I also have many different resources here in my free technical resources. So be sure to get access to this. But if you do not want access to my free technical resources for whatever reason, but you still want to join my email newsletter, whenever I create new content, I send out emails to people to let them know I have a new content available. You can join my free tech engineer school newsletter, and basically whenever I create new content, I send out an email about it. I do not spam you. I promise. It's just sending out emails when I create new content. And this is my contact page, and I'm gonna put this in the comment section below. If you want to contact me, you can contact me here. And like I mentioned earlier, I do have this blog post on SQLite. If you want to learn, if you want to install SQLite, and also if you want to learn how to use SQLite, I do have another blog post and video on using SQLite. Once again, I'm gonna link those in the description below. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Bye.